Hello, very beautiful community. Some of you have bombarded me with requests to process this extraordinary thing that Trump posted in the last 24 hours that might be the most deranged social post he's ever shared. Now, I wish this weren't so, but it is the case that professional political commentators and political analysts of various kinds are pretty good at retrospectively analyzing the consequences of Trump's actions, but are not good at thinking about what motivates Trump and what he's going to do, because he's got a personality disorder. And that creates a huge multidisciplinary challenge for everybody commentating, and generates a very bizarre reality where still, unfortunately, 90+% of Trump commentary is one way or another an attempt to sanewash him, an attempt to ascribe a degree of tactical nous, strategic consistency to him, a degree of rational transparency to him that he simply does not have. And that's why you can read a complete article in a respectable publication and it can tell you less than somebody who at least knows how to start analyzing Trump can offer in a single Instagram post or in a single, YouTube short, right? So something that Anthony Scaramucci might say or Michael Wolff might say can be more illuminating than what legitimate experts with lifelong expertise in international affairs can tell you. That's not because these experts are getting, dumb. It's because Trump is presenting an interdisciplinary challenge. You've got to actually reflect on narcissism, you've got to reflect on neurodiversity, and you've got to reflect on cognitive degeneration in the context of these two things. And I wish, as you know, beautiful community, that I wasn't as familiar as I am with narcissism. Well, no, I don't wish that. I wish that I didn't have to rely on that familiarity with the literature and so with the psychoanalytic literature on narcissism when thinking about the President of the United States, the most powerful person on earth. I wish I didn't have to rely on my understanding of ADHD and autism and the way they might interact with the personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. Trump is much more ADHD trait led, but unfortunately that again is something you've got to put right at the center if you can understand his impulsivity, right? And the interaction of his impulsivity with his narcissism. And then you've got to understand a bit of neurodegeneration and the way that can interact with NPD and also with NPD that's pulled and pushed by neurodiversity. And, for a year of my life, probably a year and a half, I didn't speak because of neuroinflammation about 20 years ago. So I know a little bit about that too. And so I don't think we want to be talking about these things in relation to the President of the United States. But that's where we are. Now, of course, it's worth clarifying that having a narcissistic personality disorder is bad ethically, and it's a psychological problem. It's a kind of mental unwellness. Being neurodiverse is not bad at all. It is not a psychological thing. But the trouble is that there can be an interaction between neurodiversity and narcissism. So putting all of this together, let's look at his tweet. His Truth Social, whatever it is. There are three extraordinary elements there, beautiful community, and because my inboxes have been exploding with the request to process this, I've actually written out some processing notes for us. So the first bit is really the threat of the war crimes. And we won't even get into the political stuff, all the obvious things you already know. It's not good for the United States to threaten war crimes and then for the West to try to say that Putin's war crimes in Ukraine are bad. Right? It just dramatically undermines, our political grip, right? The political grip of our critique of malign actors in the world, if that's what the overwhelmingly leading member of NATO is doing or threatening to do. So the next major part, and we'll take them one by one, is open up the strait. And so we've got the threat of war crimes, and then we've got what is an increasingly manic obsession that Trump's got with the strait. He keeps saying, you guys deal with it. But what's going on is he's completely and helplessly obsessed with it. And then the line that has compounded discombobulation with which this post was received is praise be to Allah, which is also a very disgusting thing for Trump to say, actually, the way he is saying it in this context. So let's analyze this. So Tuesday will be, let's just read together the whole post before we break it down. Tuesday will be power plant day and bridge day, all wrapped into one in Iran. There'll be nothing like it. Open up the effing straits, you crazy bastards, and or you'll be living in hell. Just watch. Praise be to Allah, President DJ Trump. So Trump doesn't and cannot deal with reality. Iran is not a real object for him. The Iranian people don't exist for him. That's different to them not mattering. I don't care about them. That's true too. He doesn't. But they also don't exist for him. Because even Trump's most positive objects, like Putin, don't exist for him. He has a fantasy image of Putin. And so he invites this fantasy image of Putin into a fantasy society of his own creation, of which Putin and Trump are both members. And that allows Trump to glow in all of the sort of radiant warmth that imaginary society and that imaginary character Putin emit. And now he's stuck. And all he can think of is to make the war crimes threat, to make this threat of violence. And the threat kind of works for him because it secures narcissistic supply. The same thing that we discussed in the context of his ambush of Zelensky in the White House. Because one way to get narcissistic supply is to demonstrate how you can, in an ugly and unlovely way, be the master of other people's destiny, a kind of destructive omnipotence. So this is not a delivery on that, but it's a promise of destructive omnipotence. Now, the trouble is he hasn't checked whether the threat works. But he doesn't need to, because he's just converted violence into some kind of childlike event category, because the purpose of this threat is self-regulation. It's not the transaction of a problem in the Middle East. And what's really painful for the world and for US citizens is that that is not how Mr. Netanyahu thinks about it. Because Mr. Netanyahu welcomes Trump's threat because he just sees the continuation of the war as a good thing. He doesn't care what long-term damage is accrued by the Gulf states. He just thinks it's a good thing if the Iranian regime keeps getting eroded. Whether it collapses or not is secondary for Netanyahu, and if it collapses and leads to a civil war, well, so be it. And the perpetuation of the war is a regime security need for Netanyahu. Netanyahu is not far from being in a situation where he needs war to stay in power, like Mr. Putin. And so there is this malign strategic approach by Netanyahu, right, that benefits from this sort of rather blinded narcissistic self-regulation, which is all that Trump is able to put in place of doing real politics. Now, the second line that really matters here is open up the damn strait. And Trump is unbelievably obsessed with the strait. He's fixated on it. He is impulsively in a kind of loop. Why doesn't it open? Why doesn't it open? Why doesn't it open? And it's a neurotic loop. It's not a constructive loop. So he's caught up I've put down here for us in a kind of spiral of frustrated omnipotence, which is what happens when an injured false self, because narcissistic personality disorder folks have a false self. When a false self like that is injured, confronts an object that should obey their will, but somehow inexplicably doesn't. And so what you've got isn't some kind of constructive way of engaging with, let's open up the Strait of Hormuz, but a kind of neurotic loop whereby somebody keeps trying for the 27th time to unlock a lock with a key that doesn't fit. And it doesn't fit, and it doesn't fit, and it just keeps going. Why doesn't it open? Why doesn't it open? Right? So there are certain ways of focusing on the problem. By the way, reflective, this is true about you in some aspect of your life. There is a certain way of focusing on a problem that actually becomes a way of avoiding it, right? So if I keep having 3 burgers a day, and then I keep asking myself, why am I so fat? Why am I so fat? Why am I so fat? Me asking why am I so fat in a loop is actually a way of avoiding engaging rather than engaging with the question of why on earth I'm stuffing my face with 3 burgers per day. And this is really disgusting. And it's disgusting because, of course, we have a huge problem with anti-Semitism in the West. And Israel's terrible behaviors made that worse, right? So people tend to often think, well, either Israel's behavior is good, and then the anti-Semitism is a bad thing, or people tend to think, well, Israel's behavior is bad, and there is no anti-Semitism because it's just a reaction to how badly Israel has behaved. And that's, again, an inability to hold 2 things in mind. Israel has behaved terribly, and there is an outbreak of anti-Semitism. But what else have we got? We've got an outbreak of Islamophobia going on in the West for some decades. And it's different. It's not the case that both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are just prejudices and they're just the same kind of structure of prejudice applied to different objects. The prejudices work in different ways. We'll talk about that at some point, and we've already talked about the distinct dynamics of anti-Semitism. But Islamophobia is a big problem, and part of the reason it's a big problem is that we don't grasp what it means to capture all sort of significant commitments one has in one's life in terms of religion. Because in the West, even religious people divide the religious sphere from the non-religious sphere in a way that happens much, much less in the Islamic world. That's one of the differences that actually is a key source of Islamophobia. There are others. We won't talk about it, but the problem is Trump's making it worse. Well, how is he making it worse here? So this line has shocked commentators because it's just so weird. And commentators have started wondering, well, is this really Trump going insane? None of this is Trump going insane. This is Trump getting worse. This is Trump's personality disorder getting worse under pressure and also with age. It's both. But it's not him going crazy. It's the same patterns just looping in an accelerated and more claustrophobic way in his head. So this is both mocking and owning. It's mocking. Well, I've said owning first. Let's do that first. It's owning because he absorbs this line into his own performance space, right? So he doesn't merely insult it, he colonizes it. And the spoiling bit is that he takes sacred language and just folds it into a social media post. That is both entertainment, consumerist entertainment, and domination mixed into one. So it's really quite disgusting. He owns, this is mine, and I can just play with it in any way I like, and he contaminates. He spoils, right? By inserting a bit of sacred language into his consumerist and threateningly violent post. So is this him getting worse? Yeah, it is. And the trouble is that the things that Trump's got wrong are interactive. It is normal for narcissistic personality disorders to get worse with age. It is normal for narcissistic personality disorders to be spurred on by neurodiverse types of impulsivity to get worse with age. It's normal for the kinds of fixations Trump is suffering with to get worse with age, when this is what one's dealing with. So what's the problem for us here? The problem for us is that we still live in a world that sanewashes Trump. And this presents a huge challenge, not just to commentators, but also to professional journalists, because individual journalists can't start talking like I'm talking now. They just can't. Because their institutions are still expecting of them that they're just going to say, Trump has said this, and we wonder what that means. He might mean that. He might mean something else. Now, of course, if you're doing journalistic work for a major institution, you can't just break into saying everything I've said. You're not quite free enough for that. But what do? I think you need to be able to point out the incoherence in what Trump is saying. And with a post like this, you actually need to go through it and break it down. If you are able to read it out in full after perhaps a certain hour in the evening, you should do that and get people to process it line by line. When you can't, you should summarize what each phrase in this post says. Because at the moment we're sanewashing it. On television, we're sanewashing it to a lesser extent, but still in the newspapers. Because what are we hearing? Trump has made threats toward Iran, and he has used expletives. That's not the story. We've just analyzed this, right? You can see what the story is from our analysis of it. What happens if our analysis of it is wrong? Then you need to place something slightly different, but into the same space, right? Where you're dealing with Trump's narcissism. You're dealing with the cognitive decline. You're dealing with the interaction of narcissistic personality disorder, which is a bad thing, and neurodiversity, which is not a bad thing, but can interact very unconstructively with a narcissistic personality disorder, right? You see the difference?
Right.
So just like Trump's not dealing with the real world, we are not dealing with the real world in the way we're talking about Trump. And so we need to find ways to fix this from a systematic and institutional journalistic perspective. Then what do we, citizens of the world, there's no such thing, of course, because there's no politics and cosmopolitanism, but what do we, citizens of the world, expect at this point? Well, what we expect is that his personality disorder and his capacity for self-regulation will get worse with age. A. B. Will also spiral more when Trump pushes himself into corners, of which this is an extreme example. And there is an ever greater need for conquest in the way narcissistic supply works for people with this personality disorder. In other words, they can't just be satisfied with a 4 out of 10 hit. When they've got the 4 out of 10 hit, they need to move to 4.5, which creates risk that Trump in the future will engage in other calamitous misadventures like the one he's triggered but cannot control in Iran. Thank you so much for being with me during this breakdown. Lots of love and talk soon.